Ladies and gentlemen, depending upon where you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Delighted to see you all to the first of what is a series of 3 EUHOFA webinars, and they're all related to really the key theme, which is to do with is hospitality education in decline, and also trying at some point to come up with some reasonable solutions or at least some practical advice and so on that we might be able to then implement or work on and develop up as new models or new ideas. So the whole purpose of what we're doing today is to really just to try and identify what some of those key issues are, and then moving that on into the second of the webinars, which will also be supported by some research that we're just about to undertake, which will look at the relationship between industry and education. And we're doing this internationally. All the things that we do in EUHOFA are all done on an international scale and an international context. But I thought what we'd try and do to start with is I'll just try and summarize some of the issues that have been that have been going on, and in doing that, that will then prompt, and we have a number of areas for discussion. So my short presentation, round about 10 minutes, then we will spend probably 20 to 25 minutes, maybe a little longer, with a discussion with our panelists, who I will introduce in a moment. And then you have the opportunity to pose questions that you would like to be answered. Sorry, you can ask the questions. If you could do that in the chat, then my colleague Ursula Boardman, the Crumbs Project, will be keeping an eye on the questions and then draw our attention to those particular questions as we go through. So I'm going to start off by just a quick introduction. I'm going to start to and the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the title of what we're doing today is Hospitality Education is in Decline. Is that true or false? And what our panel for today, Dominik Zembowski, who's the Dean of the Swiss Hotel Management School, Switzerland. Dominik has quite an extensive experience in the hotel school world, having been in Australia as well as in Switzerland and indeed in America. Andrew Bower, who's the principal of the Edge Hotel School here at the University of Essex in the UK. And Andrew and I have known each other for quite a long time. And he has been involved in hospitality management education and hotel schools, again, through most of his professional career. Stuart Wiggins, Pro Vice Chancellor at ICAMS in Sydney in Australia. Again, Stuart has a connection between Andrew and myself in that he was one of the Bournemouth University students, but before Andrew and I got there. So there is this sort of interwoven connectivity between all of us, one way or the other. Me, Peter Jones, I'm the moderator. I'm also an advisor to the EUHOFA board. And Ursula, who is the head of centre at the Crumbs Project, which I chair, who is also helping me as a moderator and keeping her eye on the chat for us. So that's the panel for today. And the webinar, short presentation, roundtable discussion on some of those key issues, posted questions, if you can use the chat function to post your questions, please. And then we'll try and do a summary towards the end, and then the next steps, which we're taking towards the next webinar, which will be in February. Okay, I did send out a very short, snappy little survey pre-webinar, really asking just 4 questions. One was, in your view, is hospitality education in crisis? 80% said yes. 20% no, but that I think we'll hear that depends on where you are in the world. In your view, are the number of young people entering hospitality courses going down, going up, much about the same? And the international view is that they're going down. So what we have is we have evidence of declining student numbers, not everywhere, and we'll come on to that in our discussions, but we are seeing closures of some hospitality programs. We're seeing some mergers of institutions, and certainly we're seeing more of that move of hospitality into business schools, and perhaps loss of key aspects of the curriculum as a result of that. So that there is good evidence to support that. And I was at a conference yesterday, and Lisa Wild, who is joined us today, made a presentation to that conference to our UK colleagues and making pretty much the same points, but got some really interesting data to do that. We know that staff demand for hospitality staff remains very high. But we've got to ask ourselves the question, is this a permanent decline? Can hospitality education bounce back? If it does bounce back, what's it going to look like? Will it look the same as the past? Or do we need to do, as Dominic would say, be like Madonna and completely reinvent ourselves? Probably more than once. So what are the factors that are impacting on hospitality education? I think firstly, government and public perceptions of the industry. Have they changed? If they've changed, have they changed for the better or changed for the worst? Is it about the public perception of what the industry stands for, how the industry behaves? Does that influence young entrants coming into the industry? Government perceptions of the industry depends very much on your location. And certain governments are very supportive of tourism and hospitality. Other governments just see it as a fringe activity, but it generates quite a lot of nice money. Funding for professional programs, especially in publicly funded institutions, over time has gone down. And because of that, then the unit of resource, as it would be called, has gone down, which means you've got less opportunity to do what you might think are the important things. So it becomes more of a mass program rather than a more individual tailored program, because you just don't have the funding for it. Cultural changes perhaps happening, and differences in valuing hospitality careers. Are young entrants looking at a career within hospitality? Are they even interested in a career in hospitality? And what's causing those probably social as well as cultural change? And the other, which I think is interesting, is misunderstandings about what hospitality education actually is and what does it involve. So I've tried to identify the notion of what I think are characteristics of hospitality education, the idea that it merges theory and practice, and it does that through active experiential learning. You know, it is hands-on, it is the art of doing, and it is the art of doing and the art of knowing, as I put in here. So it's a balance between the doing skills, which could be the human skills or the soft skills, and the knowing, which is how do I apply those in this particular context? How do I make this work as a business? So it's about understanding the context and the processes involved, but balancing them by the ability to actually carry those out and interact appropriately with individuals. And I think we've seen a lot of academic shifts, or some people would call it drift, within institutions to move away from this idea of the industry connected curriculum towards a more academic and theoretical curriculum, partly because I think of some of the funding issues. It's cheaper to do, it's easier to do. You don't need the same level of resources that you would do if you were doing much more of that industry connection. And again, I think it's interesting that most institutions would say, yes, we take advice from industry when we're developing curriculum. But then on the other hand, they say, yes, but I'm an academic and I know best. So do they really listen? Do they really take note? Or can they, even if they take note, can they implement the sort of things that industry would say is important because of the constraints within their own institution? So what's happened as a result of all these changes taking place? Well, I think there's a loss of specialist faculty and certainly a loss of industry experience in the teaching of hospitality. Because those people like me, we get old, we move on, and there isn't the same depth of cohorts because of the fact that the courses are nowhere near as strong as they used to be. You haven't got that depth of experience in cohorts. The other issue, of course, is if you've got good industry experience, but you don't have a PhD, are you likely to get a job anyway within education? And the answer is it's going to be much more difficult than it was 20 years ago. Loss of professional identity and hospitality culture within institutions, I think that's particularly relevant, something that's very, very much pushed and portrayed in private hotel schools, with this idea of maintaining this professional identity and the culture of hospitality in the way that the institution works and is managed. And if you're just one of many thousands within students within a school, you don't have that same sense of professional identity. Less focus on work-based experiential learning, in many cases, very little opportunity even for work-based or experiential learning. And hospitality disciplines marginalized within large institutions. So what I refer to is it's actually slipped down and they become one of many courses as opposed to becoming a core course that was often there and what institutions used to be known as. That may be a factor of size, but I think it's also part of this strategic drift. So I thought I'd just quickly give you some of these. These are observations that have come up from, I wrote an article published last week, which was, is hospitality education in crisis? And some of these are some of the comments and some comments that I received from the survey as well, from people about what they believed was going on. And I thought they were quite interesting. The first one refers to the idea of academic drift. The second looks at there weren't changes in hospitality education. So the education arm, if you like, of the industry wasn't changing to reflect quickly enough to reflect what was going on in the industry. And then the other is this question of the increasing focus on the business aspects, perhaps to the detriment of the human skills and the doing aspect. So we're much more about knowing than we are about doing. And I thought that this one was interesting. I chopped that a little bit. But this increased focus on technology as being a solution to things, but then the idea that needs students to appreciate these soft skills much more and be able to be much more, shall we say, resilient in understanding what the skills are, but also being able to apply them. And then the shift towards management-focused hospitality fails to address the core competencies. And I thought this was an interesting comment because this came from a very large consultancy company. Hospitality is service orientated. It requires the things that we know that it requires, but are they any longer an integral part of a hospitality curriculum? And a comment from the US that what's going on certainly in Europe and the UK is also being mirrored in the US as well. So what changes would they like to see? Different collaborative models, recognize the value of choice, flexibility, customization, closer collaboration. That's really just a repeat of the first one, but also changes to the regulations to allow much more flexibility for students, a lot more flexibility in course design, and quicker to be able to reflect the changes in the industry. So that we'll stop at that point. And now what I'd now like to do is to really, I want to start with the issue about, well, what is causing some of these changes? And is it in decline everywhere, or is it only in decline in certain parts of the world? So Dominic, I know you had some interesting responses to that question.
Thank you very much for that first presentation, Peter. That was great. Is hospitality in crisis? Hospitality education in crisis? I think it depends where you are. It also depends who you are. It also depends how you get your funding. Are you a state-funded university where the doing part costs money? And your CFO or someone wants to please the vice chancellor at the university, so let's close the service restaurant, the service laboratory. Also it depends on the planners, really. Have you handled the different enrollment cliffs that have been predicted around the world? The Incredible Shrinking Future of College was an article by Kevin Carey, and he said that it's not going to be a trouble for the elite colleges, for the Princetons and the Penn States, to bounce back, but there is a lot of doom and gloom out there. Heidelberg, I was reading, Heidelberg vocational schools are merging. There's a Mexican school that closed that was in EUHOFA, but then all these factors, there's probably a reason why you have to reinvent yourself, and that's what we're doing in these seminars. When I talk to my I worked in Malaysia hospitality education for several years. When I talk to my buddies out there seems to be a continued growth in the programs. Asia Pacific University has just taken on hospitality, and it's got 14,000 students, but 3 new programs are opening. And Taylor's, Sunway, and Tianjin, Dusitani, they've all taken the sort of European programs, and in some cases they do it better. So is hospitality in crisis? In some ways, yes, and necessity is the mother of invention. And so let's get down to the hard yards of sorting that out.
Mm. And Andrew, what about from your perspective? The Edge Hotel School is relatively new. It's only been going for what, 12 years now, 10 years, 12 years. Yeah. And it was started with, I think, should we say, the notion of bringing back this idea of doing and knowing and bringing those together. And so you perhaps have a benefit because your model is quite unique in the UK. But
yeah, I think as well, Peter, as you know, particularly, this institution wouldn't exist without a very hefty sum of money being pumped behind it. I doubt very much whether the Edge Hotel School would exist in its current form if we didn't have a substantial amount of money being put in by one philanthropic individual or a set of individuals to get it going. And that is key to this. The other thing that has enabled us to be where we are today and to survive this long is that for the first 5 or 6 years, we were completely independent. In other words, we weren't part of the university, although we used validated, or we used their degrees. We were able to develop a very unpolluted type of education, which we're now part of the university, and we're starting, part of the job is to prevent some of the traditions of the universities dissipating the distinctiveness that we've created. I know we've talked previously about research, and research is a great thing, and it's something that we're going to have to bring in. But I think in bringing that in, we've again got to have a distinctive side to this, because otherwise, once again, it's just about knocking out articles and raising the profile of individuals. As far as we're concerned, we've got this weird thing called industry engaged education. And I keep bleating on about this to anybody who will listen, which is we work with industry and they help us to deliver the curriculum to the students. So it's vibrant, it's exciting, it's up to date, and the students can actually make contacts with industry. So to a certain extent, I don't think we are a normal sort of institution. We've only been created because of the absence of traditional values and pressures. And I think that's true of a lot of privately funded institutions, so they can do that. They can afford to perhaps find their own path without having to conform to some of the traditions or expectations that hold a lot of other institutions back.
Interesting point. Stuart, you're very much involved in running a private institution in Australia, and of course you do have a certain different regulatory framework in Australia. But how would you see what you're doing in Australia as being different, perhaps, from what's happening in the UK?
So thanks, Peter. If I may, I might just reflect. Obviously, I want to put an Australian lens on my comments. I might look at that through the different stakeholders, because we've already mentioned that this is a stakeholder engagement is a big thing for us moving forward. And I think to answer the question, is it in decline? We've got to look at the influences of all of the stakeholders, because our industry is bigger now than it's ever been. So it can't be in decline through lack of demand for skilled professionals. Into room stock in Sydney all of the time. We did before the Olympics, and now we're growing again. But let's look at that in just a second. Firstly, if I do not help at all with the perception of hospitality, hotel education in Australia. We're held in a tight grip by the regulators, and also now, if students are applying from overseas to come to Australia to study hospitality management, then the chances are that they will have their visa refused because it's not IT or something similar. There's very much a focus on the skills list for that the country is supposed to desire, and it's very rare that hospitality is on that list, and therefore our numbers are being restricted right now. Doesn't help us. Industry is growing, so there's a growing demand. I think industry to a certain extent has been part of the last few years, because they haven't been that discerning, because they need people. So often they will take people with a pulse rather than focusing on quality and driving quality back to the institutions. They will complain if the institutions are not providing them with the skilled professional looking for, but at the same time they'll still take them because they need them. But we really need our industry to hold us to account a little bit more. From the student perspective, it's a two-tier thing. International students are still wanting to come, and there's a demand for hospitality education, more from overseas than from our domestic students. Are more interested in professions that they think are sexy, and that's work out there for them, that they're asking themselves the question, why invest in my education now if I can just go out and start earning? Why rack up a debt? So domestically it's a struggle, and the other domestic, and because hospitality is not seen for them as being sexy now. And that also, and there's another stakeholder involved in that decision making. So you've got the neighbor effect of, do I really want my son or daughter to be seen to be studying hospitality when they could be doing law or IT or whatever? So we've just launched Australia's first apprenticeship in collaboration with Marriott International. And real struggle, because and a lot of that has been because the parents have been putting their applying, number one, but number two, because it involved travel potentially to work in different Marriott interstate, they were worried about their children traveling during their degree, which I think is really interesting. So we've got this other stakeholder that we need to influence in Australia a little bit more, to get them to understand our industry and its potential. From the institution side of things, we can look at three different periods. In the 1990s, I think there were only 4 universities in Australia who were offering hotel or hospitality related programs. It was mainly private hotel schools, and all of who were based on the European model, were successful. And then when higher education was deregulated in the early 2000s, and the 4 universities became 29 universities offering hotel and hospitality programs. And that's when the business degree model took hold. That universities were coming in with their business to 3 or 4 hospitality electives, and basically presenting those as programs for future professions to be. Most of those universities have now pulled out of hospitality or hotel, and really we're back to the quality providers that were in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is the quality providers that are left, and that does include a university provider as well. So I think there's an opportunity there for us, but there's so many different stakeholders that we need to get back engaged with and influence. And we've got to think about ourselves. What are some of the issues? Things like, do we still continue to call our programs hospitality management? Are we still going to battle with the perception of hospital our current students and their parents have by retaining the same name? Or do we continue to drag that baggage with us? Or is thriving what our industry is and what it does and what it can do for the world? So there's lots in there, but hopefully by looking at through those lenses of the stakeholders, I've given a little bit of a taste of what's happening in Australia. But it goes back to what Dominic said. It really depends on who you are, where you are, and how you're looking at the issue. There's still great potential there. We just need to harness it.
Yeah, there's been there's a couple of interesting observations from Sherry, who's in India, runs a school in India, where he's saying the situation in India is also similar. You can read it for yourselves, where reputed institutions are doing okay, but some of the others aren't doing quite so well. So there is an issue about that. It's about location, I guess, but it's about location. It's about perceptions of the institution, what the institution stands for as well. So, but I think those things we've touched on a lot of issues there, which I hope we're going to be able to bring back together throughout the whole of these series of webinars. I'm sure we will. But I'd like to think a little bit more now about the potential entrants, the younger people coming into the industry or potentially coming into the industry. Have they changed? Have their aspirations changed? Have their values changed? And are their values actually being entirely influenced by their peers or their neighbors or their parents, or are they developing a different set of values, certainly post-pandemic, which is impacting on the way they look at hospitality education? Andy?
Yeah, right, happy to start that one off. I would be absolutely mortified if the next generation didn't come in with a completely different perspective. I mean, we're looking certainly from the view I can see in front of me here on the screen, a different generation. So I would want them to come in and be far more challenging as to what the benefits are. They do come in with different values from our perspective, and this is international students as well as our own home students. They are coming in with very different perspectives of wanting something that represents them, certainly that they can feel proud of. Just going and doing a course, I can't think of many of our students, perhaps a few postgraduate students, but a majority of the undergraduates are coming in because they want to go into the industry. It's a very definite decision. Now, that may be because of the fact that we are a hotel school, and therefore you don't have that flexibility. If you're going on to a more generic course, you've got more flexibility. But certainly they're coming in with a commitment to events, hospitality, broader aspects of tourism, customer service. They're coming in with those values, willing to go into those industries. Again, perhaps it's sort of particular because of the nature of our organisation, but a majority of them, and we're talking about 90+%, will go into the industry. There's very little leakage, there's very few going out. They're looking for value for money. Yes, I don't think they're quite aware at this stage of the costs that they will incur, but that's, I think, a youthful thing. I do think it's most probably guardians, parents, influencers who most probably might put them off the industry because of their perceptions of what can and cannot be achieved in a career in the industry. But that said, in our experience, the industry is doing its level best to promote a more proactive, a more positive, a more exciting image of opportunities. So I know that the general tenet of this is, we're in crisis, but actually the students who we do have should be the starting point of anything we want to create in the future, because they do have enthusiasm, they are willing to challenge, they are willing to look at things in fundamentally different ways.
Yeah, interesting point. And I think you're right. The industry is also stepping up to the challenge because they have a recruitment challenge. So in addressing that recruitment challenge, they are actually working extremely hard to try and change the perceptions of the industry. Whether that's
industry, yeah. That's,
go on.
I was just saying, industries had to adjust to it. Post-COVID, and with this new generation that we learn from in our colleges, the split shift badge of honor. I've worked 18 hours, but I've given 9 hours work. Had a little nap in the middle. That doesn't that has no currency anymore. Plus big business degrees with the hospitality. People want micro credentials. They want specific stackable qualifications. Are they going to stay in the classroom for 3 years and just listen to lectures? So the whole thing is changing. Sorry for interrupting, Peter. I was getting too enthusiastic.
No. Sorry, Dominic, can I come back to you on that one? The interesting we were having a discussion just about a week ago on split shifts, and the predominant view is, how can you not manage your workforce better? And this wasn't from lecturers, these were from students saying, if you've got to have split shifts, there's something seriously wrong with your management style. And that's what gives me confidence in students to say, that's a very wasteful, awful way of managing people. You've got to be really desperate if you're going to be doing that. So I think there is a pent-up willingness to challenge some of the more traditional things that we've got used to in the past. They won't put up with that, and they see it as a failing.
Yeah, and we've got quite a few examples, haven't we, of quite well-known both restaurateurs. You can't do it so easily in hotels, but the restaurateurs have actually made financial management decisions to say, I'm actually going to close for these 2 days of the week, which means all my staff get 2 days off, and they're back-to-back days off. It's not one on Monday and one on Friday. So, that they've made that decision to change the nature of their business model, and they've had to in order to be able to accommodate the staff shortages. But it's to the benefit of the staff. Stuart, from your perspective.
Yeah, I think the comments there about how we work with this generation because to actually get them through there, let's just take the bachelor degree as an example. I don't have students sitting in the classroom for 3 years any longer, and we've really got to look at the bachelor degree model and make it more mobile, as Dominic said. I do believe there's a place for instilling the basics in first year. For me, that first year is absolutely, and we can the core elements of what makes a professional is something that we need to work hard on in that first year, and then combine the work with the exploration of those concepts as that student moves forward, and have a model that allows them to be continuing their learning journey and working towards their qualification, but while they're out in industry. And we held a symposium recently, and we had industry there, including providers of mobile technology and options, you know, way beyond just badging and so on, but ways in which students can have their curriculum wherever they are on the job and refer to it and collect their experiences in a way that their colleges can track and be engaged with. And I think that is the way forward. It's and as well as presenting it in a different way, because as I said before, hospitality, I don't know that that's the title that I would put on that learning forward. And I've got this idea of human experience management that I just, it's my head, because I think that that is pretty much what we do, and it's got applications outside of our industry, because it's one thing I think that we never leverage enough is how attractive our graduates are to the broader industries out there. And that is something that parents don't see. It's not something that students or potential students that we're talking to see. It's not something that governments see. And we need to harness those stories, because you know, all of those core elements of being a hotel and hospitality professional, there's such a broader application and value, and I think we can harness that more. Effectively.
I think that's a point very well made, Stuart. And I'm going back some years now, when I had an involvement with EHL, and I remember going to one of their student-led careers activities and so on. And what was interesting for me is the number of careers companies or employers who were there actually seeking to employ. And there were the Dorchester Collection, and there were the other hotel groups that you would expect to find. But there was also Google, and I think there were Amazon were there as well. And obviously what they were looking for was that service experience. They were looking for that you call them human skills. Let's stick with that terminology. What they were looking for was something, and the confidence that students having followed hospitality programs have about going into the world and speaking to people and greeting people face to face. And that's true. And I certainly have seen that throughout my career, the number of individuals at the different companies that have come to seek our students because they embody all the characteristics that they're looking for. Doesn't matter about the product knowledge, they learn that on the job. It's the characteristics that we're interested in. I can see nods from Andrew and Dominic.
And just on that, Peter, if I may, the research that I did for my identified 6 capabilities for entry-level employment in hotels. We've taken that instrument that I used that was hotel focused, to gather data across all the other specializations that we educate for ICM, entrepreneurship, marketing, accounting, sports management, and so on. And the initial results of that are that those industries value exactly the same capabilities as were identified for hotels in my research, with one small difference, that the accuracy, which was a capability for hotels, was not coming through for these other specializations, where they were valuing more lifelong learning, self-directed learning capabilities. One difference. So hospitableness was as valuable to those other specializations, for example, as it was for hotels, and principalship and so on. They were all valued in exactly the same way, which I think is interesting for how valuable what we do is for the broader business world and community.
So I find this very interesting, because what we're advocating here is we've pushed the split shift culture too much, and hospitality education needs a major rebrand. Human experience management, I'd actually call it the management of the human experience, because then the parents would like that better, because management is the lead word. But we've looked at this before with hospitality. Some of the Scandinavian research years ago was all about service management. But when we actually went to do some market research, it was decided we can't call it a bachelor degree of service management because the parents will find that too janitorial. You know, I'm mopping up. But then when you look at where SHMS students, they're in financial services, luxury brand management, everything like that, but it's under this umbrella of hospitality, and so maybe that's not such a silly idea to rebrand what we are to something that names what the graduates have, but you've got to still have this customer service injection in the first in the foundation year, and that's what the universities don't want to pay for. They don't want to pay for service. They'd rather get 300 students in an introduction to management class in the amphitheater, and then, you know, as you get on, you might take a couple of hospo courses just before you finish your degree, and that's not an immersion model at all. So that's why some of the unis are in trouble.
I think we've got some interesting, I just want to tackle one quick question, if I may, and quick comments from all of you. And then we'll look at the comments and the questions that we've got in the chat, of which we've got some very interesting stuff there, which I hope you can all read. So the next question really is only related to where we're coming from. If we're going to do some of these things, who are the stakeholders that we really need to engage with in actually moving the whole thing forward? It's no good institutions just trying to say, I can do it on my own, because they can't. So who are those stakeholders, and can we identify them, and how do we get those stakeholders together? Now, Andrew, you work on industry engaged education, so clearly you've got a very strong group of stakeholders who are involved in what you do. So can we start with you, and then we'll move on to the others?
I mean, my starting point would be not necessarily the external stakeholders, but the actual students themselves, the generation. There's some really interesting comments coming up on the chat about what's generation, and we seem to classify generations by letters and a whole load of characteristics, and that actually doesn't seem to permeate through to the students that really exist with us. We've got really good students, and they're motivated, as I've said before, and they're focused, and so they are a key stakeholder group, rather than just understanding the more generic characteristics that we ascribe to them, actually looking at what they want to achieve. They should be, because they're going to be people who will either make or break these things. As far as the industry is concerned, as you mentioned, industry engaged education is a big thing for us. Yesterday, we had 40 companies here trying to recruit. Well, we're a very small school, so, you know, huge numbers. That could be desperation on the industry. It could be, you know, the fact that we have got good students. But whichever way round, they have got to be integral to the delivery. But the real problem is the tradition, not just of parents, which we've discussed, but as far as I'm concerned, in the UK, the tradition of the higher education hierarchy in the way in which we operate. And that is the big problem. As I said at the beginning, we wouldn't exist if we had been created by a university, because it just doesn't fit the mold. So I think, yes, there are funding issues. Yes, there are all sorts of other external stakeholders, but the main stakeholder group that we've got to change mind of is, dare I say it, an internal one, which is universities, certainly in the UK. Very powerful lobby.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with a word of that, Andrew, which is unusual for me, as you know. But you're absolutely right. I think it's this institutional strictures and structures, as I call it, that force everything. You lack flexibility. The funding model means that you've got to have consistent, coherent 3-year or 4-year programs or whatever it is, and that's not what the world needs. And if you read some of the comments, you'll see that that's the need to have a much more flexible approach to these things. The universities aren't interested in that. They all seem to me to want to do the same thing at the same time, and they all want this standard model because it's easy to manage and it's easy to control.
And can I just commit professional suicide on a grand scale here? I don't know if there are many Trekkies out there. If so, you know, live long and prosper. But those of you might recognise what this is, which is a Borg cube. Now, this is going to be something that most people are going to roll their eyes and say, "My God, why does he have that on his table?" The Borg cube in the Next Generation, where effectively a group that drew in all of the distinctive differences and just compiled them together into one grey mass, and everybody was the same. And one of my ex-colleagues, when they left, said, "Don't forget, we are not the Borg cube. You know, we're not part of the traditional infrastructure, and our job has got to be differentiated, to be unique, to maintain those differences rather than becoming part of the generic higher education establishment." So there you go. I've committed professional suicide. You all know I'm a Trekkie.
Dominic and then Stuart, very quickly, who do you think these key stakeholders are?
Well, Stuart might agree with me, but I think it's the parents as well. They love for the students to come out from a strict behavioural changing hotel school, but grandma and granddad also love it that the student topped up or received a university degree. That's still the currency in many countries, and so from that point of view, there's got to be some combination of that. You can't just get a certificate for the grandparents. It must be a degree, and then they all have their own. It must maybe one from the United Kingdom, maybe one from here, there, or wherever, you know. And so I think we've got to look to that a little bit. Stuart.
Absolutely agree. As the reason that I went through earlier, that there's 4 of those that we are working on all of the time at ICMS now. It's to engage with government more, to work with industry more closely and rebuild that trust, work with our students and, you know, with other institutions too. At the recent symposium, we had other institutions there because this collaborative thing, we've all got to get the momentum and create the momentum together. The parents is the 5th stakeholder, but I'm going to put another one out there, and it really, and in terms of the perceptions that are built for government, students, and for parents, and the negative perceptions that they have of coming to study what we offer, and that's the press. And it really depresses me that there's any conversation in the press about low-skilled professions. The first cab off the rank is always hospitality, and that's like a dagger through my heart every time I hear it on the radio or on the television, because that's a big part of what creates the battle that we've got. So I think if there's another stakeholder that maybe we need to think about how we influence.
Absolutely. I'm just going to, if I may, just quickly go through a couple of the comments and the questions that we've received. There is one which, from Mario, which I think is a very apt in a way, is vocational training or management training? Do I see a difference? And I think one of the problems that we've always had is the terminology that we use. You know, what's the difference between training and management, or if you like, or training and education? And I refer to that and I think to myself, well, hang on a minute. If you take the medical profession, we train doctors and we train nurses. So why do we insist on, in our terminology? Why do we insist on losing the word training when the reality is that we are part and parcel of that training function? The other is the whole notion of vocation. You know, what's wrong with vocation? What's wrong with vocational training as being a component part of what we're doing? But we seem to shy away from it. We don't want to, oh, no, we can't talk about that. Oh, no, we'll get into trouble if we start talk about that. But yeah, I think those are issues that we've grappled with as certainly from an institutional point of view. They don't want to be seen as doing anything that's got vocation or training associated with it, and yet they'll all be happily developed medical schools to have, you know, medical training taking place. It's just crackers. But anyway, can we move on? Right. Somebody raised the point about degree apprenticeships, which of course Stuart raised, which is the issue there with that relationship that you've now developed for the first apprenticeship type degree program in Australia. I mean, we've had the opportunity of those in this country for a long time, but it was interesting that I saw last week a commentary that one of the largest catering companies had graduated 24 of their graduate trainees with a chartered management degree through the apprentice degree route. Why? Because there wasn't a hospitality or related one available. So there are issues there. Why hasn't that happened? But this whole issue about flexibility, people wanting to be much more flexible in terms of the delivery of the curriculum, perhaps going into the workplace, but then looking to gain recognition for what they're doing in the workplace rather than having a base qualification and then starting, is something that we need to explore in a lot more detail. But just to give you one example of where I've been involved, and I know that's working extremely well, and it's in a country that you probably wouldn't think, well, how did that happen? In Nepal, they developed a program called the Bachelor of Professional Hospitality, which is to all intents and purposes a degree apprenticeship. It's not called that, doesn't work that way, but it works very much on the model that Stuart has suggested, in that they come in for an immersive experience for the first semester, they're in the college, and then they go out into industry. And they're in industry for virtually, they come back for short periods into the colleges. It's validated and being managed and run by Kathmandu University, and they've now franchised that model to colleges all over Nepal. So they're saying this is the model for the future. How do we get higher education into rural communities? This is the way that we actually do that. How do we get these people so the people are earning, they're in employment, but they're actually doing a Bachelor of Professional Hospitality at the same time? My involvement was helping them to come up with a name, the Bachelor of Professional Hospitality. So it does what it says on the tin. And you know, given the fact that it's now operating throughout Nepal in 6 different colleges, and it's only been running for 3 years, is to me testament that that model has really, for that country, has really taken off and is doing something. Now, that is a very flexible model for delivery, and it's something that we'll move on to for the next time that we meet. But I think we're 5 minutes before we close now. Is there anybody got any other questions? Well, there's some interesting comments. I'll leave you to read those for yourself. That the education system's broken, it doesn't work. Universities have betrayed younger generations. I think that's right too. Biggest problems, yeah, the situation. Are we really delivering something which is really fit for purpose? So we've got some very good comments in there, and I just want to give all my panelists the opportunity for any final comments before I try and summarize, and then we'll talk about the next steps. So can I start with you, Andrew?
Okay. It's really interesting to see the chat that's going on and the passion that is in there. And I think that is absolutely vital to change. if we had just been talking to a screen, a set of screens, and nothing had been going on, it would have been quite depressing. I think we recognise that there is a need for change. I think there are different stakeholder groups, as you know, both Dominic and Stuart have said, in different locations, and there are different battles to fight in different locations. The fact that we have got a passion to do it, and I go back to my previous comment about the fact that the students that we have coming in are still passionate about our industry, bodes well. I know, Peter, your very biased questionnaire was out there saying, you know, so are we in crisis? Are we in disaster? Yes, we've got problems. We've got big problems. We've got significant problems. But there are solutions, and there's a will. You know, there is a passion there. Yes, the numbers of people who will be able to address that are going down a little bit, and we shouldn't underestimate it. But I think working with some of these stakeholder groups, we can still do some great things. And does the degree have to be the main medium of education for the future? No, absolutely not. I think, you know, we're adapting as we go along, and hospitality education, or whatever we want to call it, needs to adapt to recognise that.
Thank you, Dominic.
I'm absolutely blown away by the comments that there's these people. I really want to chat to some of these people outside of the room. I still get very angry that vocational education and higher education have these two columns and never the twain shall meet, because in Switzerland we put them together, and there's two rigorous internships, and we feel that, you know, that produces the best graduates. But we really need to take better care of our students now with what we're offering. And recently, I just want to, on a personal note, I've been to the doctor to have a little thing removed from my face here, Peter, as you get older. And I just want to say that I would never trust a doctor that learned everything from a book. And there are some degree programs out there where you can learn everything about hospitality from the book. And we don't do it in real life. Why do we do it in education?
Yeah, very good point. Yeah. Stuart.
Well, I think it's always a privilege to be amongst people that are as passionate about this as I am, and I know it would be lovely to hear more voices. And in terms of engaging with stakeholders and influencing stakeholders, I think those stakeholders need to be in this environment where we can actually engage with them, and they can see and hear and learn and really start to take away with them a deeper understanding of the issues that we face and want to change. There was one comment I wanted to highlight, because for me this is one of the big issues as well, and it's certainly a case in Australia, the lack of a professional body, professional standards for us to use as a framework, because it's a missing link, particularly in terms of the relationship with the government. Our regulator says that our programs should be informed by a professional body or professional standards, and yet for us putting forward curricula for accreditation, we can't point towards a professional body in Australia or professional standards and threshold learning outcomes that have been agreed at level 7, which is the last year of the bachelor degree. But in terms of professional standards, we've got nothing. So maybe that could be a central thing that we could use across all of our bailiwicks to influence change. But thanks for having me.
No, thank you very much. So I'm not going to try and summarize this because you will get automatically an artificial intelligence summary of what's been going on today. So you're going to get a report of that. There is a recording of what's been taking place today, and that will be available to you as well. I'll post a link to the recording once I've actually tidied it up a little bit. I think what we have identified, as Andrew said, there's a lot of passion around in terms of people feel very strongly about our area, our provision, what we do and how we do it. But there's also, I think, a very strong recognition of the need for change and the flexibility that goes along with that change. I also accept entirely that in order to effect those changes, we need to collaborate an awful lot more. Part of the rationale for these sorts of webinars is it does have the opportunity to at least start discussions with so many people all around the world. So we're not just talking to ourselves anymore, we're actually talking to people who come at these things from completely different perspectives, different stages, different parts of really different, where hospitality education means different things. And I think that's a very important dimension to that as well. So it's about collaboration. It's about, I think, changing the nature of the model, and that will be the third in the webinar series. So that's highlighted that. But let me just come back to the first question. The first question was, is it in crisis, true or false, whatever? And I think the answer is it's in decline, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's in crisis, because if from those small, relatively, it might be quite smaller provision than we've been used to in the past, we can grow something that's actually very flexible, that's actually very dynamic, that actually is meeting the needs of all of the stakeholders. Then we really are in the position of doing something really quite strategic, but also it could have a major influence. And that's where I think we need to be. And that's what we'd be working towards. So can I thank everybody that's actually contributed, particularly to Andrew, Dominic, and Stuart, and Ursula, who's been keeping track and keeping us on track as far as the chat and the questions and so on are concerned. I found it a very stimulating discussion. I hope you felt the same. The next in the series of 3 will be in February. And in order to give us some additional material for that, there will be a survey which is going out through EUHOFA and a number of other bodies within the next 2 weeks, which is what's called looking at the gap that seems to exist between education and industry and trying to understand more about that gap. So that survey will be going out via EUHOFA, which is hopefully they've got 16,000 readers. So, and that's really designed at industry. There is a section of that survey which is more designed for education, but you'll get both parts. So the idea is that I will be making sure that everybody who's on today's webinar will actually have access to that survey. And if we can get anywhere upwards of 500 responses, then that would be brilliant. But it also suggests that we're getting a fairly representative sample when we get to those sorts of numbers. And as I said, it will be international, so we can compare and contrast by different parts of the world, which again is important. And we can compare industry's views against educators' views and see where those gaps actually are. So that will form the basis of the second webinar in February. The third in the series will be looking at how do we develop these new models. So the second one is more about that stakeholder engagement. The third one will be about what could we do to develop much more flexible models or new models for hospitality education. That will be run in conjunction with the EUHOFA Congress, which is happening just immediately after Easter next year, and that will be live streamed. So not only happening in the Congress Hall, it will also be live streamed, so it will be available to everybody around the world at the same time. And we hope that one might be slightly longer, but also it will also have the opportunity of engaging perhaps a bigger audience in terms of that flexibility. So thank you very much to everybody. There is a short survey which will pop up on your screen when at the end. If you could just quickly tick on the relevant boxes, that would be helpful. But thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I think a very, very helpful, very useful, and very engaged discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.